I haven't uploaded very many sociology videos in a long time, so I figured I got quite a number of subscribers, so I figured I'll do one. I'm actually on vacation. It's Columbus Day, which the whole idea of Columbus Day is a good sociological question, but we're not going to be looking at that, because Columbus, Native Americans, why we're celebrating, etc., etc. But we're not going to talk about that today. What I'm going to talk about today is the Thomas theorem, uh, because actually my classes at school are going to be talking about that this week. And it has some interesting aspects, which I thought it'd be worthwhile to give a short discussion about. William Thomas was one of the earliest sociologists, an interesting character. I'll talk a little bit about that. And he was around in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, and he died around 1947, I believe. But he wasn't active until his day. He was active until about 1937. In 1923, he said something which said with a wonderful statement, which encapsulates many of the ideas which we can use in a sociological framework, although it has implications in psychology and many other areas. What he said was, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Right? In other words, if you believe something is to be real and you act upon it as it is real, then the reality is that the real consequences are important and have implications in the real world. Sounds logical. It's actually a very interesting concept, and it goes much deeper than probably Mr. Thomas ever thought himself. But he was an interesting character. I want to talk a little about his characters. He was one of the earliest sociologists. He had a position lecturing at the University of Chicago in the beginning of his career. Prior to that, he learned some other things, languages, and which brought him probably to the idea of what they call ethnology. He wanted to know about the ethnic cultures and the separation and differences between one culture and another, which seems to be like a forerunner to sociology. And that brought him to many trips to Europe, back and forth. At one point, he actually studied under a fellow named William Wundt, which the psychology students might recall. In Germany, was the person who had the first psychological laboratory in Germany, in Leipzig, Germany, in the 1880s. So he was a psychologist in some ways in training, although he brought that into the ethnic studies, which from there he built the sociology. Interestingly, a lot of his original work was very much influenced by the psychology that he studied. He went on for many, many decades. He studied women and women's issues. A matter of fact, one of his most famous books was called Sex and Society, published in the 1920s. He had been publishing it prior to that in installments in different journals. It obviously, when you think about it, coming from a academic journal, an academic series called Sex and Society, generated a lot of interest, especially in those days. There was not much research done on the effects of gender and society. It's quite a interesting book. You can actually find it in the Gutenberg collection, a free. You can download it for free, but it's very primitive, very not. The conclusions are not something that one would actually want to base anything upon nowadays. But it really was actually not very in today's terms, this wouldn't be considered controversial. It wasn't very extreme politically, one way or the other. In those days, they were days of the suffrage movement, the times where women were actually fighting to get the right to vote, and the people were fighting not to give the women the right to vote. And so that was actually the feminist and the anti-feminist movements in those days. They both came out against Mr. Thomas's work, although there was at least a few reviews that said this isn't really very controversial stuff. But if you look at it today, he does say some things which are sort of unusual, like women are somewhere between their status should be somewhere between children and men, someplace in between that. Not the way we look at things today. But it was very, very controversial. And he was a controversial guy to begin with. He was very bohemian, and he liked to go around with a lot of women. He was married for many years. Eventually, he divorced his wife, and he remarried a woman 36 years younger than him. But actually, sometime prior to that, he was thrown out of the University of Chicago due to some sort of scandal. I'm not exactly sure. I've seen reports that has to do with his Sex and Society books, has to do with some other controversial liberal views that he had. The government didn't like him, etc. I'm not exactly sure what the story was, but then he never came back, became a full professor again, and eventually he worked in New York, and he had a visiting visiting professor status in Harvard, and eventually he retired with his very young